listening to Against the Grain on Pacifica Radio, found online at kpfa.org. I'm Sasha Lilly. Last May, workers at the Ssanyong Motor Company in South Korea took over their factory when faced with the layoffs of 36% of their workforce. The occupation lasted 77 days and was ended in pitched battle with police commandos, with tear gas being dropped on workers from helicopters. It's just one example of the long history of working-class militancy in that country. Radical writer and activist Loren Goldner has been living in South Korea and studying that history. He's the author of an article titled The Korean Working Class, From Mass Strike to Casualization and Retreat, amongst other works. And I had the opportunity to sit down with him last week to talk about the South Korean working class. I began by asking him how South Korea became the industrial success that we now know it to be.
It's a fascinating story. The Korean Peninsula was colonized by Japan in 1910 and remained a Japanese colony till 1945. And Japan, of course, was the first Asian country to really break through to what we could call modern capitalist development. And while it did super exploit Korea during those 35 years, it also did develop Korean industry and what they call modernize the country. When Japan left the Korean Peninsula in August of 1945, it left behind 2 million proletarian wage labor, industrial workers, miners, etc., who were not there before. Japan had also used Korean labor in its Manchurian colony in the 1930s and 1940s. So that was a very fundamental part of what became the Korean exception. Taiwan was also a Japanese colony in roughly the same years, and there was a similar development there. That was one thing that made them different from all of the ex-colonial, third world, developing countries, whatever you want to call them, after World War II. The second thing that happened in South Korea that was quite unique was an integral land reform. As you know, in most third world countries, land reform remains an extremely crucial issue, and the control of what we could call pre-capitalist latifundia type ownership of land is the source of a tremendous amount of reactionary politics. South Korea was under the pressure of the North, which essentially when the war ended, the peninsula was divided between a Russian, North Korean communist, in quotes, occupation, and in the South, which was occupied by the United States. And the northern part of the peninsula immediately implemented land reform and gave land to the peasants. So in order to win a social base for this regime in the South, which had no social base except for the American army, land reform had to be pushed through there. It didn't happen immediately, but by the outbreak of the war in 1950 and by the end of the war, for sure, the old Yangban class, that was the old landowning gentry, had been not exactly expropriated, but bought off. They were bought off with bonds that, through inflation by the mid-50s, were almost worthless. So it was an effective expropriation. And this was extremely important because the result was that productivity of agriculture increased markedly because suddenly the peasant class was no longer handing over its surplus to these absentee landlords living the high life in Seoul, but actually, could reinvest it themselves and, most importantly, use it to educate the next generation. One thing that is really striking about South Korea is that it considers itself, and it is in reality, the land of what you could call human capital. I mean, that's not a term I would use normally, but that's the term they use because the southern part of the peninsula has very few natural resources, and much of the a lot of the industry that was there was either destroyed during World War II and, above all, during the Korean War. The country was largely flattened. The entire peninsula was largely flattened by 1953. So what Korea had were the skills and brain power of its population. You don't have to spend much time in South Korea to see that sometimes it seems almost more like a cram academy than a country. The emphasis on education, which comes from the Confucian background in part, is just all pervasive. And so the peasants were able to use the surplus to educate their kids, send them to university, and already by the 1960s, there was a stratum of very well-educated technical people. One other aspect that's very striking about Korean history and South Korean history in particular is the very high level of literacy, even when it was a very poor country. In 1960, the per capita income of South Korea was something like $300 or $500 a year, putting it on the same level as India or some poor African countries. And 50 years later, it had emerged as effectively what you could call an advanced capitalist country. And this high literacy rate, which again goes back to the Confucian tradition, played a very important role in that. So land reform and very high development of what they call human capital really made it stand out. Now, one cannot neglect the geopolitical aspect, because as a result of the Korean War, as a result of the Chinese Revolution and the general Cold War, the United States saw South Korea as a potential showcase along with Taiwan. They wanted to have some counterweight to the very great appeal of the Chinese Revolution in the 1950s and 1960s. It's important to remember that North Korea had a higher level of industrial development up until about 1970, into the early 1970s. So these pressures were very strong, and the United States allowed South Korea and Taiwan to do things that it did not tolerate in most of Africa, Asia, Latin America. They allowed South Korea to put up high protectionist walls, to have a much higher level of state management of the economy, which again has certain roots in the Confucian tradition, but one can only go so far with that, because obviously for a very long period of time, that Confucian tradition basically supported the old agrarian Yangban elite. But nevertheless, if you look at Asia as a whole, you notice that the Confucian-influenced countries, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, in addition to China, of course, all have some very important parallels in terms of statist bureaucratic development, which fused with more modern influences that came from Europe and the United States.
So you had a situation then in South Korea following World War II, following the division of the peninsula, where, as you say, the United States sanctioned land reform and a much greater involvement of the state into the governing of the economy. And so Korea then moved from light industry to heavier industry, to the point that we now recognize with South Korea of great technical capacity. And yet, during most of this time, dictatorship. Tell us about the political context in which the, quote, South Korean success, one of these Asian tigers, took off.
First of all, any understanding of post-World War II Korea has to start with the civil war that preceded the outbreak of the Korean War. That when the Americans arrived in 1945, the Americans were really relatively unprepared to occupy South Korea. There are very, very few people in the American military knew anything about it. But what they did know was that there were a large number of people on the Korean left, and not all of them pro-North communists, socialists, other sort of honest left liberal types who wanted fundamental change. And actually, right after the war, the factories in South Korea were occupied by these several million workers with no particular ideological notion of what to do with them, but simply for survival. The Japanese fled, and there were the factories, so the workers took them over and started running them themselves. So a battle ensued that lasted up to 1950 for control of industry and to put down radical peasant movements in the countryside, and hundreds of thousands of people were killed in repression before the war broke out in 1950. So, and this is a very little known aspect of Korean history. There's a very good book by an American academic named Bruce Cummings called The Origins of the Korean War, which probably is the first serious history of that pre-1950 Civil War. Now, when the Korean War ended with the division of the peninsula, pretty much where it was when it started, kind of battling over a couple of miles here and a couple of miles there, 2 million people killed, a carpet bombing of North Korea that rivals anything the United States did in Vietnam. There was not a building standing in North Korea after the war, which is one of the reasons that a lot of North Korean industry was built underground. So up till 1960, a rather ineffectual dictator was running the country with, of course, very strong U.S. support, and his name was Lee Syngman. He had lived in the United States for decades, spoke fluent English, was able to sort of pal around with the American occupational authorities in a way that very few other Korean politicians could. So he built a rather shaky dictatorship on the back of this repression before the war, and which continued in a police state form after the war. In 1960, Lee Syngman was overthrown by massive student demonstrations, and there was this one-year opening of democracy, which again started to move rapidly to the left. And in May of 1961, a guy named Park Chung-hee staged a coup. Park Chung-hee, through the period up to his murder in 1979 by his own Central Intelligence Agency chief, supposedly his best friend, was generally depicted as a typical tin-pot U.S. puppet, but in fact he was a more interesting fellow than that. He had been an officer in the Japanese army during World War II and had served in Manchuria, where the Japanese themselves were carrying out something like what became the Asian development state after the war. It was a very interesting, little-known episode where all kinds of things were tried that were not even tried in Japan. So this area had modern trains, modern cities, all of it, of course, built for the Japanese colonial population. But nevertheless, Park Chung-hee was there, saw this, and clearly that was his model for what he wanted to do with Korea. So he seized power, and he seized power with a group of junior officers. He and all of the rest of the initial coup participants were from poor rural families. They knew about the condition in the Korean countryside. They saw their sisters being forced into prostitution. They saw their brothers working, their short lives in the fields, and they were determined to do something about it. And they were sort of copying a failed fascist coup in Japan in 1936, a very similar kind of junior officers. So Park implemented this model that he had first seen as an officer in Manchuria with the help of the United States, with the help of Japan, which was selling all kinds of second-hand factories and so on to Korea. And almost immediately, the Korean growth rate in pure statistical terms was 7-8% a year, which was remarkable for the time. But nobody took it terribly seriously, and as you say, it was very light industry, textiles and things like that, with and very importantly, a very largely female workforce, so that the first phase of class struggle against the dictatorship were women in the textile industries and other light industries striking for basic union rights. About 1970, they had sort of established themselves as a major exporter of textiles. And by the way, it's another important point is that unlike many third world development regimes that sort of closed themselves off in autarky, PAC had a real export model. It's something very different from what you had in protected economies in Latin America, such as Argentina or Brazil or Mexico. They wanted to really carve out a niche for themselves in the world export market, and they did. And so after starting in the early 70s, they shifted over to heavy industry. And this, of course, brought a lot of men into the workforce, and this was sort of the second phase of the Korean labor movement. Now, when I say labor movement, of course, you can imagine that under the conditions of dictatorship, it was not exactly people going to open union meetings and saying, well, let's have a strike. It was constant, brutal repression, people being thrown into jail, tortured, murdered, and so on. And most of the strikes, of course, were beaten back by thugs and military people. By the early 1980s, Korea was actually in a position to start moving into high-tech production. And again, they were getting most of the components and technology from Japan and the United States. But by the early 1990s, they had become an exporter of world-class, high-tech products of different types. So that's the basic story of the dictatorship.
The program is Against the Grain on Pacifica Radio, found online at kpfa.org. I'm Sasha Lilly, and my guest today is Loren Goldner. He's a writer and activist based in New York City, but he spent 4 years living in South Korea and writing about the Korean working class, which is the subject of our conversation today. So in 1980, some of these forces that you've been describing came to a head in a struggle to overthrow the current dictatorship, with results that were bloody, combative, and that most of us don't know about in this country. What happened there?
The Kwangju Uprising of 1980. Kwangju is in southwest South Korea, and it's in the poorest region called Cholla Province of the entire southern part of the peninsula. And PAC was from the southeast, and if you look at a map of Korean industry, you see that almost all the big industrial concentrations are in the southeast.
And that was the dictator at the time.
Yes. And Korean politics is just unbelievably regional. So, in virtually every election, if somebody from Cholla Province is running for president, no matter what party he belongs to, he gets 90% of the vote in Cholla Province and so on. And PAC, with his cronies in the southeast, built up these very impressive industrial cities such as Ulsan, which by the 1980s was exporting world-class ships and the Hyundai automobile and carving out a place for itself in that heavy industrial market. So, but the Cholla province felt really neglected, and rightfully so. And after PAC's assassination in the fall of 79, again, there was kind of this opening like in 1960-61. And before the military could reestablish itself, there was a lot of ferment. There were riots, there were demonstrations. Things were really getting out of control. And as a matter of fact, some people say that just before his best friend killed him in this cabinet meeting, they were arguing about how to deal with this movement. In May 1980, things came to a boil in Kwangju. And for about 8 days, the population of the city took over the town. 200,000 people capturing the city hall, breaking into an armory and arming the population. And the result was that, and we should keep in mind that this was going on at the very same time as the Iranian Revolution. So the Jimmy Carter administration in Washington was getting very concerned about having two revolutions on the Asian continent at the same time, and there's all this emergency communication between Washington and the U.S. Embassy and the U.S. forces in South Korea. And at a certain point, the green light was given to a crack regiment of South Korean paratroopers to go into Kwangju. And they were informed, of course, that what they were dealing with was a communist uprising manipulated by North Korea. And a massacre ensued. Nobody even knows how many people were killed, but some estimates are as high as 2,000, but it was certainly in the hundreds. And this totally changed the climate in South Korea. The Kwangju massacre was blacked out in the media, but through various other circuits of communication, it quickly became known what had happened there. And it marked a shift from kind of liberal democratic opposition to the South Korean regime to a much more militant, Marxist-oriented kind of opposition. And the immediate upshot of that was thousands of radical students going into the factories to talk to the working class.
Which is parallel to what happened in Western Europe and the U.S. in the 1970s, right?
Yes.
They turned to the factory.
But unlike in Western Europe and the United States, this movement called the Hakchul movement, it means just from the university, was extremely successful. And some of the student industrializers, if you want to call them that, became the leaders of strikes. And so militancy increased, and finally in 1987, under different kinds of pressures, because there was also a middle-class democracy movement, civil society, and so on, developing parallel to the workers' movement, and they really overlapped to a great extent. And I shouldn't neglect to mention Christian churches, which in liberation theology in the Catholic side, and some liberal Protestants among them, opened up their churches to the movement and allowed all kinds of study groups and night classes and so on. Later, workers who were interviewed said that without that help from the students in the churches, the movement as it developed in the late 80s was impossible. In 1987, 3,000 strikes erupted in South Korea. It was impossible to blame those strikes on outside agitators, the North, and so on. Even the students who had worked in factories said, we didn't plan this, and we didn't control this, and we couldn't have controlled it if we wanted to. And this was simultaneous with a democracy decree from the military regime. The 1988 Olympics were happening the following year, and the left opposition wanted to use that situation, the international attention, to focus on the tortured dictatorship in South Korea, and so this explosion was the result. And it basically forced open the society in a way that's never really been rolled back. By 1990, there were established radical unions in South Korea. One of them, called the Chonno-hyuk, the All-Korean Union of Workers, was openly anti-capitalist, and that's how the dictatorship was broken.
You write that the left in South Korea in some ways created itself during different times, that there were breaks between the earlier traditions in, say, the early 20th century and what emerged in the 1970s, which you've just been describing, liberation theology, and then a turn towards the left. How would you characterize those dominant currents within the South Korean left over time and through this period that you've been describing and to the present?
Let me just say a word about the earlier traditions, which, because of the repression, the civil war between 45 and 50, and the ongoing dictatorship after the war, as well as people fleeing to the north to get away from this repression, running into other kinds of repression there was a virtual total discontinuity between the pre- and post-World War I Korean left, which many people don't know, actually was more anarchist than communist. And that's a whole very interesting story. This was true in Japan and China as well. And in some sense, you have to really think of all of this as one region, because Japan kind of played the role of Paris for radical students, leaving their countries under dictatorships and going to study in Tokyo, and every country had its big exile contingent in Japan that went back to work in Korea or China. But, as I say, the discontinuity was almost total. Now, as this new left emerged in the 70s, and above all after Kwangju in the 1980s, what they had immediately at hand was Maoism, Stalinism of the Soviet type, and Stalinism of the North Korean type.
And how do those two differ?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I'm not sure if one can really point to any important differences. I think I don't want to say that it was arbitrary who was attracted to what. But in reality, I don't think they differed very much. So it
was more spheres of influence that you looked towards?
Models, and behind it all, of course, was the model of the Soviet Union, but the model of the Soviet Union in its Stalinist form of the 1930s. And, of course, the Korean Communist Party and then the North Korean Communist Party by the mid-1930s were totally Stalinized. Many of the militants that I met who had been deeply involved in the 1980s told me that in their underground study groups, they read books in Japanese. It's relatively easy for a Korean to learn Japanese because in Japan, all the modern Marxist stuff was available. So that's how a lot of other influences came into South Korea. But as of 1990, even Trotskyism, which exists in all kinds of forms in the West, was really relatively little known. Now, that situation had changed by 2000, 2005, but the movement sort of ran out of steam in the early 1990s. The repression continued. The transition to democracy was very rocky. There were the streets of Seoul and other big cities were full of tear gas almost daily in the late 1980s and 1990s, or early 1990s. Campuses were in a state of siege. Huge battles were fought between thousands of radical students and thousands of police. Just seeing thousands of riot police on the streets of Seoul just became commonplace in those years. Even when I first got there in 1997, just walking down the main street, Chongno, just hundreds of riot police just standing around. And once I asked somebody, well, what was going on? And said, these high school girls are protesting over increased prices for lunches in the cafeteria. It's just incredible overkill.
And given some of the tendencies that you've just described, how did the disintegration of the Soviet Union affect the shape and the contours of the Korean left?
Very important. As I say, the movement was running out of steam in the early 90s. And the Soviet Union, it was very surprising to me to hear this from various people that I met 15 some years later. It was experienced like the death of God in the 19th century in the West. Anyone who was around in the 60s and 70s in the U.S. or the United States knows that there were pro-Soviet elements, but the critique of Stalinism, of the Trotskyist form, the anarchist form, the left communist form was in the air and widely debated. Whereas in Korea, because of its different position in terms of overall capitalist development, much more open to the Stalinist forms I mentioned earlier, the Soviet Union just loomed large, even for people who were pro-China or pro-North Korea, in a way that we just didn't experience it here. So I met people who just went into seclusion when the Soviet Union collapsed. They just said, well, I guess socialism, communism is a myth after all, and it's just not possible. And there was incredible demoralization. And in a way that happened in the United States around 1970, a little later in Europe, people with middle-class credentials that they could cash them in, and became professionals and sort of privatized. And it was also at that very time that postmodernism in different forms, Derrida, Foucault, Lacan, you name it, suddenly started massively being translated into Korean, not from French, mind you, but from English. I can only imagine what Derrida sounds like in Korean. But so there was a very deep ideological shift, and sort of the core, that of course was the workers in the steel mills, steel plants and auto plants and shipyards in Ulsan were not reading French postmodern theory, But of course, there were more and more struggles were defeated. The radical labor union, openly anti-capitalist named Ssanyong was wiped out by repression and replaced by a much more supple and moderate union that's known as which is still the dominant federation called the KCTU, the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions. And then the real coup de grace was the Asia crisis of 97-98.
And you're listening to Against the Grain on Pacifica Radio, found online at kpfa.org. I'm Sasha Lilly, and I'm speaking today with Loren Goldner. He is a writer and activist who has written extensively about the left in South Korea, the working class movements there. That's the subject of our conversation today. He's the author of Ubu Saved from Drowning, Class Struggle and Status Containment in Portugal and Spain, 1974 to 77, and Herman Melville, Between Charlemagne and the Anti-Mosaic Cosmic Man, Race, Class, and the Crisis of Bourgeois Ideology in American Renaissance Writer. So, Loren, just before the break, you mentioned the Asian financial crisis, which led to the International Monetary Fund bailing out South Korea in 1997 with all sorts of conditions about how the economy needed to be restructured. And yet, some of the terms that the IMF called for were actually things that those in power in South Korea had been pushing already. So tell us about that crisis and its outcome for the working class in South Korea.
It's absolutely true that from the early 1980s onward, the military regime and then the first phase of the democratic transition were pushing neoliberal restructuring of the South Korean economy. That's a very complicated question, which I actually am not totally confident that I can...
Privatization, removing barriers to trade,
yes,
and cutting back public services and the like.
It was a very uneven thing, and Korea to this day has important import controls of different kinds. You may be familiar with the 2008 movement in the streets against the free trade agreement with the United States, which has still never been approved, which mobilized at its peak about 1 million people in June 2008. Even if Korea might nominally allow the import of American cars, if anyone happens to buy them, they will immediately be subjected to a tax investigation. And other non-economic motivations sort of keep people buying Korean. But not in any way like during the 70s and 80s when it really was a fairly closed economy. So this was, you're familiar with the concept of salami tactics. You can't get everything you want immediately, so you get it in slices. And this was sort of what was going on between the government and the labor movement from the early 90s to 97. And the capitalists were always saying crisis, 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 but they talked about it so much that nobody really took it seriously. There were still some very militant strikes in 95 and 96, like the telecom strike of, I believe, 95, lasted over a year. But then finally the tsunami hit with the Asian crisis, first in Thailand, then I think in Indonesia, and finally in Korea, where all kinds of short-term capital just fled the country almost overnight. And it's almost even after 2008 in the United States and the West, it's almost impossible for us to imagine what that meant in social terms. Families breaking up, when parents lost jobs, sometimes parents just walking away from children, hundreds of suicides, and massive unemployment. And in the midst of all this, the labor movement was, of course, really back-footed. And it was just at that time that this long-term bourgeois liberal dissident named Kim Dae-jung was elected president in December 97. That was a month after the crisis broke out. It's very important to note that all three major candidates in that election were forced to sign an agreement to enforce the IMF provisions even before they got elected. So Kim Dae-jung, who had been fighting against the dictatorship for most of his adult life, suddenly found himself president of South Korea with a long laundry list from the IMF of things that he had to do. At Christmas 96, the Korean parliament, with no left deputies present, voted through a whole series of labor reforms, which led to a fairly effective general strike that blocked those reforms.
And this is prior to the IMF
January
bailout.
97. And it was kind of a standoff, but they managed to, again, with salami tactics, they got most of what they wanted by the late spring of 97. And then in the fall of 97, the IMF just increased the temperature tremendously. And so Kim Dae-jung comes in, and the real upshot of his regime, in addition to managing this sudden explosion of unemployment, was to establish a so-called tripartite commission, sort of on a European model. The tripartite meaning the government, business, and labor. And the moderate elements of the Korean labor movement, the KCTU, went along with this. Now, as you can imagine, commission and agreement was absolutely meaningless for anything involving protection of workers. And I guess it still sort of exists on the books, but it's totally ineffectual. But that 97-98 economic crisis plunged the labor movement totally onto the defensive. Probably the most important fact to retain about the contemporary situation there is that 60% of the workforce has been casualized. Explain what you mean by casualized. Up until the IMF crisis, or certainly coming out of the big strike wave of 1987-1990, workers got 20, 30, whatever percent wage increases, and they had job stability, and there were legal protections that made it not impossible to lay them off, but expensive and difficult. And that was the number one priority, of getting rid of those things. And so more and more of the strikes that's from the early 90s on involves attempts by employers, usually successful, to impose 2- and 3-tier contracts. And could these casualized workers be in unions? Well, that has become a very complicated and difficult battle, because the success of imposing casualization with all kinds, through the IMF crisis, hundreds, thousands of small enterprises, often very well organized by this radical union, they simply went bankrupt and disappeared. So by the early 2000s, the remaining well-organized unions, which were, guess what, in heavy industry, Hyundai, and some of the other big so-called chaebol, that's the big conglomerates, they managed to hold their own. But it was at the expense of sort of turning their backs on everybody else. And so the KCTU is really despised by a lot of... This is the moderate trade union federation. The Korean equivalent of the AFL-CIO is simply despised by large numbers of workers in the casualized workforce and the unemployed, because they are clearly recognized as essentially sort of a corporate entity that defends this minority of 20%, 30% of well-paid, well-organized workers, and very rarely extends any kind of solidarity besides a verbal solidarity to the 60% who are just out of it. They can be fired at any time, just for absolutely no reason, with no legal protections. And yet there also seems to be tension the other way, that these regular workers, those fortunate 10% who are lucky enough to actually have these protections, have in recent years actually attacked casualized workers who go on strike, I guess, without the sanctioning of the unions. There have been episodes of that. There was an auto strike. I think it was one of the reorganized Daewoo plants in 2007, where a bunch of casualized workers wildcatted, and I don't think the management even had to do anything. The organized workers attacked the casualized workers. Said, what are you doing? You're destroying our plant. You're destroying our jobs. And there have been many attempts, most of them unsuccessful, to bridge that gap. But it's become the issue in the South Korean labor movement.
South Korea obviously got hit very badly by the Asian financial crisis. And then 10 years later, there was the global economic meltdown. How did that affect workers in South Korea, and what sort of militancy bubbled up from that crisis?
I'd like to report that things had turned around in the working class movement, but I'm afraid it just ain't so. The defensive situation that really began with the IMF crisis, everyone in Korea just calls it IMF. It means I am fired. It's really never been corrected. And so, for example, in 2007, 2008, there was a very important strike of a chain store called Eland, which had been taken over from a French chain that had sort of decided to bail out of Korea. And I think over 100 stores were involved, and I'm not sure, but several thousand workers who occupied the stores. And these were all casual workers demanding some kind of job security and the other things that the permanent organized workers have. This was occasioned in part by a kind of Orwellian law that was supposedly, I can't remember the name of it, designed to, it made it mandatory for employers to give permanent status to anyone who worked for 2 years. So in 2 years, 11 months, and 28 days after somebody started working, they would just be fired en masse. So the Elan workers struck and stayed out for 12 months, fought the police on a number of occasions, but finally the strike just collapsed. The following year, May 2009, a small auto parts plant south of Seoul called Ssanyong announced, I think, about 1,500, 2,000 layoffs out of a workforce of 6,000. And they had already been downsized from about 8,000 a few years before. Interestingly, this firm was ultimately owned by a Chinese automotive company. The general idea was that the Chinese automotive company really just wanted to shut down Ssanyong and take the equipment and move it to China. They were restructuring, laying people off, and then they announced these massive layoffs, and those who were on the list to be laid off occupied. And they held the factory for 77 days. Some workers who were not laid off also joined them. And the local union president stayed in for the entire 77 days. And after about 4 weeks, the police attacked, and then finally even units of the army were involved in the final assault of Ssanyong. If you search it on the internet, I presume you can still find these video clips of military helicopters flying over the plant, dropping tear gas that had a special chemical element that burned the skin. They had cut off the water and finally even the electricity. They were very concerned because there was a huge paint department, and once they turned off the electricity, there was a greatly increased possibility of fire in that part of the factory. And the workers just sort of fought tooth and nail right up to the end until they were all trapped in one part of the factory, surrounded by thousands of riot police and soldiers, and they finally caved. And not only were they defeated, and this is important, for the first time after a struggle like that, the government came after the militants with all kinds of indictments. I believe that local union president was just recently sentenced to about 4.5 years in prison. A number of other militants also facing prison. And very important to note in terms of labor relations in South Korea, under South Korean law, a struck company can actually seize the assets of individual strikers. And there have been instances where workers have lost their savings, their homes, their cars. anything that can be carted off. And I believe there was some of that following the Ssanyong episode. And even though thousands of workers from the surrounding area did come to the aid of the Ssanyong strikers, fought the police with them, the strike ultimately died in isolation. Those workers did fight outside the Ssanyong plant, but they didn't strike in their own plants, and probably that was not possible or realistic. But that just gives you a sort of sense of the mood.
Right, and that was last August. The program is Against the Grain. I'm Sasha Lilly. My guest is Loren Goldner. You can find links to his writings about the Ssanyong occupation and other works on our website, againstthegrain.org. We have a link to his website there. So I wanted to, in the last minutes we have left, ask you about, given the militant history you've been portraying and yet also the depressing dimensions of it too, this move towards casualization, very intense repression from the powers that be, what are the prospects as you see it for the radical left in South Korea at this point?
In December 2007, a hard right government under a president named Lee Myung-bak was elected with massive support. Lee Myung-bak was the former mayor of Seoul, and sort of in Mussolini fashion. He was kind of famous for making the trains run on time. That is, actually really fixing up the urban transit system. And prior to that, he'd been a CEO of a big South Korean company. And in the midst of all the dislocation after the IMF crisis, and then there was 5 years of this rather ineffectual left-of-center former labor lawyer named Roh Moon-young, Lee Myung-bak came in with a lot of even working class support, and he narrowly edged out to be the candidate of his hard right party, the daughter of Park Chung-hee, who was presenting herself as, the real continuity. Look back to this rosy time when Korea was growing at 7 and 8%, and we're going to do it again. Even though the world situation has totally changed, Korea is trapped between Japan and China. Japan with its high-tech products, China with its emerging manufacturing. They call it the sandwich, it's the sandwich, and Korea is the meat. So this gave momentum to this government, and that's the context for the success of this repression. I mean, there's just this feeling, and Ssanyong seemed to illustrate it, that just resistance is futile. You want to resist, this is what you're going to get. And so I'm sorry to say, Korea was hit fairly hard by the 2008 world crisis, but it bounced back rather well. So you can read in the mainstream press, the Financial Times, New York Times, etc., that unemployment in South Korea has dropped down to probably 5% or lower. But what they never talk about is that that's based on this huge casualization of the workforce. So at the moment, the left itself, as you can imagine, was routed in that 2007 election. The pro-North Korean elements still control both the KCTU, which I mentioned, and the KDLP, that's the Korean Democratic Labor Party, which works closely with the KCTU. And their candidate was the presidential candidate of the KDLP in those elections with the basic slogan, unification first, and then we'll talk about reform. And this just was a total turn-off to all kinds of people. The party had gotten 8% of the vote in the 2002 elections, and it fell to about 2% in 2007. And immediately, this little rump left split in two between people who just wanted to go on with this pro-North Korean stuff, and another minority that was more like a European social democracy called the Progressive Alliance. But they're both basically in the political desert. And then you want to talk about the radical left, that is the people who reject both of those parties. They're isolated in, I'm sorry to say, rather small groups that many people would consider sects. I believe that the real prospects for any kind of renewal of the radical left in South Korea. And I think this is true in virtually every major capitalist country, is a great internationalization of perspectives, because the recovery of the South Korean economy since 2008 has largely been based on economic dealings with China. There are 4,000 South Korean firms invested in China, and China has now replaced the United States as the main trading partner of South Korea. And it has replaced the United States as the main trading partner of Japan. There are even more Japanese firms invested in China. And pretty soon there will be Chinese firms invested in those places to the extent that it's allowed. So there's a certain kind of momentum. I do not want to be over hasty about this, but sort of a decoupling, maybe that's not the term I want to use, from an American-centered, export-oriented kind of economic strategy to something more Asia-centered. I believe it's in that context that the workers' movement itself really has to link up with, in the Korean case, with Japanese workers, and now, for example, with these recent very interesting strikes in June in China, to the extent it's possible with Chinese workers. That's a difficult row to hoe, because you can't just go to China and say, where's the nearest union office? Because the official unions, of course, are almost entirely controlled by the government and would frown on such overtures. But nevertheless, those kinds of connections are developing.
I've been speaking with Loren Goldner. He is the author of a number of books, including most recently Herman Melville, Between Charlemagne and the Anti-Mosaic Cosmic Man, Race, Class, and the Crisis of Bourgeois Ideology, an American Renaissance writer. He has lived in South Korea and written about labor struggles and struggles of the left there. And we have a link on our website, againstthegrain.org, to his website with his many writings. He's also the editor of a new online journal called Insurgent Notes, and we also have a link to that. Thank you so much, Loren, for being on the program.
Oh, it's been great.
And my name is Sasha Lilly. You've been listening to Against the Grain. Thanks for listening, and please tune in again next time. Against the Grain is co-produced by Sasha Lilly and C.S. Song. Please visit us on the web at againstthegrain.org, where you can find on-demand and downloadable audio, submit comments, and find ways to reach us. You can also call us at 510-848-6767, extension 670, or look up Against the Grain Radio on Facebook. Our engineer today has been Frank Sterling. I want to thank him for that.